Greetings. I am Rob Volmar, book review and online editor for World Literature Today. The brand new March issue of WLT should be in mailboxes and on newsstands by the time you see this, and features a special section on writing the Polycrisis, Dispatches from a Calamitous Planet. That section has essays, poetry, and fiction from the United States, Lebanon, the Philippines, Venezuela, Ghana, and the southern cone of South America, as well as offering a snapshot of how the polycrisis is unfolding globally. The section is anchored by an essay from Richard Heinberg titled From Climate Crisis to Polycrisis, and Richard is here with us today to talk about it. Richard is a senior fellow at the Post-Carbon Institute and the author of many books, including The End of Growth, Peak Everything, Power, Limits and Prospects for Human Survival, and most recently, a report called Welcome to the Great Unraveling, Navigating the Polycrisis of Environmental and Social Breakdown with Asher Miller. Richard, thank you so much for your time and visiting with us today. For the benefit of our viewers who may not be as familiar with your work, could you tell us about the Post-Carbon Institute and the work that you do with them?
Sure. Post-Carbon Institute is a small nonprofit think tank that's been around since 2003. And as the name suggests, our main work is in researching and communicating about the end of the fossil fuel era and how that's going, how it's likely to go, what the implications are likely to be, how we can get through this as best we can.
You penned an essay entitled From Climate Crisis to Polycrisis that anchors the special section in our March 2024 issue. What is the polycrisis and what are the components that find confluence in it?
Right. Well, human society has always had problems, but sometimes the problems tend to sort of gang up on each other. And what's happening right now really doesn't have much of a precedent in human history because even though, as I say, sometimes problems gang up on each other, it's the scale of the problems that we're facing today that really makes the situation unique. We're talking about existential level crises like climate change, global climate change. Humans have never, I mean, weather is always changing and climate changes sometimes gradually, but the scale of climate change that's occurring now and in the pipeline over the next few decades, again, is kind of off the charts in comparison with anything in history. Then resource depletion. Humans have been depleting resources as long as we've used them, but the scale of resource depletion in the modern world, again, is off the charts. Everything from fossil fuels themselves to soil, water, fossil water that we extract from the ground and use, and it's not there anymore. Minerals, and then those are mostly non-renewable resources. Also renewable resources like fish and forests. We're using them faster than they can regrow. So resource depletion is a serious problem now, but if current trends continue, it's likely to get to be a much more serious problem as the century wears on. Then the presence of toxic chemicals in the environment. Again, this is something that goes back in history. It's not something that humans have never done before, but again, it's the scale. We've introduced tens of thousands of new chemicals as a result of industrial processes into the environment, and in many cases in very, very large quantities. And we're seeing the impact on not only other species, but also humans themselves. Some of these chemicals are hormone mimicking chemicals that actually impact human reproduction. Male sperm counts have declined by about 50% in the last 70 years. and the rate of decline is increasing. So toxics are a much more serious problem than most people realize. Then there's the financial crisis. It erupts from time to time, like in 2008, and everyone gets really nervous from time to time. But overall, underneath the surface variations is the fact that we're building up a bigger and bigger mountain of debt of historically mammoth proportions. And this is happening because as the economy grows, people's expectations of future investment returns and profits also grows. And so there's the justification for taking on more and more debt. I'm not just talking about government debt, which many people get very frustrated about, but household debt, corporate debt, all of these categories of debt are increasing dramatically. If the economy stops growing for any reason, then suddenly a lot of debt becomes due or comes due, and there's the possibility of cascading debt crisis, which would wipe out many trillion dollars of wealth very quickly. Then there's political polarization. Again, nothing entirely new in human history, but it's happening at a time when we need to solve all these other problems. And if you don't have a functioning political system, then how do you deal with a problem like climate change, where everybody has to come together and make some sacrifices and agree on strategies and so on? We're not done yet. There are new technologies coming into play. At the forefront is artificial intelligence, which has the capacity to speed up all of these other trends. I mean, yeah, there are those who say that AI will be able to help us solve climate change, with all the sophisticated mathematics and so on, that we'll be able to identify the most effective pathways and technological interventions to head off climate change. But AI itself uses massive amounts of energy. And in just another, I don't know what it is, 2, 3, 4 years, it's going to be using more energy than many whole countries. So where's all that energy going to come from? In the immediate phase, it's going to come mostly from fossil fuels, because that's what's supplying 85% of current world energy. So, but that's just one of the threats of AI. AI is also going to increase, and that's another polycrisis threat, because we have been developing weapons over the last 80 years or so that are potentially civilization ending. Obviously, nuclear weapons, and sometimes we sort of take them for granted because they've been around so long. But governments are developing new ones all the time, including the U.S. government, and new countries are gaining access to nuclear weapons, including now North Korea. But also autonomous weapons that take AI-driven autonomous weapons that take the human element out of warfare. So any sense of compassion or self-limitation is just out the window. Chemical weapons, biological weapons. Again, AI will help with the development of more effective chemical and especially biological weapons, because AI is where, everybody knows GPT. AI can string together words in ways that make meaning. Well, AI is also very good at stringing together genetic sequences. The letters of the DNA alphabet can be interpreted, reinterpreted, rearranged very effectively. And there's the NVIDIA, which is one of the foremost companies developing AI, is hard at work on a chatbot that, instead of using language, is using the DNA alphabet, so that you put in right now with ChatGPT, you can put, well, I want an essay on, the French Revolution or something, and it'll spit out a comprehensible essay. Well, what do you say? Well, I want an organism that will have these particular characteristics, and there you go. So are we finished here? um, yeah, that's enough. I've just given you 7 of these. And so again, it's the confluence of all of these threats and the fact that they're mutually interacting. It's not as though we can just play whack-a-mole and we'll get climate change over here and we'll get nuclear weapons over there and we'll stay on top of these problems. The way we're solving climate change is to replace current energy usage with renewable energy sources like solar and wind, which requires a lot more resource depletion and will produce more toxic chemicals. So until we get a handle on the process that's driving the polycrisis, we're just going to be trying to deal with individual problems in ways that are completely inadequate because new problems will keep arising.
I ran into that interactivity when I was putting together the questions for today. And I was particularly concerned taking a look at ammonia fertilizer production
Mm.
and trying to kind of think through, well, how does this work without hydrocarbons? And so I actually used Gemini, which is Google's new AI tool, to say, okay, explain to me how it is that we're going to make uh, ammonium fertilizer without hydrocarbons. And so it kind of spit out a few answers, and there was an interesting a new plant that's opened in Finland, I believe it was, where they're basically using like like renewable energies to electricity to make or hydrogen in specific as kind of the driving agent. And as I dug down into the particulars, the details of how they make this happen, um, it's like, well, okay, but where did the energy come from to build the plant? Okay, well, where does the energy come from to power, this function and that function? And I realized it's kind of like trying to, build a pyramid starting from the top and working your way down because there's nothing underpinning all of those things. Or as when I have conversations with people about so-called renewable technologies, I'm like, well, right now, all of that activity is being subsidized by fossil fuels. We need fossil fuels to make solar panels. We need fossil fuels to make wind turbines. And they're like, well, but you could make them with, other forms of energy. I'm like, yeah, but who is actually doing that? Like it's one thing to say, yes, it's physically possible, but we all know that there's an intersection between what is possible and what is profitable. And just because you can use an alternative energy source to make a solar panel doesn't mean that anyone is going to, or that the product that you would make through that process would be inexpensive enough to roll out, at the scale and the speed that people are talking about the renewable transition. So
Right.
it becomes almost like a tautological um, argument where it's like, well, we could get off fossil fuels if we could just have fossil fuels to get off of fossil fuels. And it's like, yeah, I've heard this conversation from a lot of addicts in my life. um, most people are familiar with and concerned about the climate crisis. Given that we've been holding climate conferences and meetings since the early 1990s, how would you characterize our collective response thus far? And, most importantly, are we winning?
Hmm. Right. Well, there's an easy answer for that question, and it's no. And it comes from, simple observation of the data. Um, are carbon emissions declining on a global basis? That's the key question to ask and to answer. So far, the answer to that question is no. Carbon emissions are still increasing on an annual basis. Now, that's despite all of these meetings, as you mentioned, but also the installation of massive amounts of renewable energy infrastructure. Last year, 2023, the world installed a record number of solar panels and wind turbines, right? And yet emissions still increased. How can that be? Well, that's because so far renewable energy is just adding to the energy of fossil fuels. It's not actually displacing it. And part of the conundrum, a big part of the conundrum, is economic growth. Everybody wants the economy constantly to grow, right? So we're using more energy. If you want to get more stuff done, which is what makes the economy grow, then you need more energy to do all of those things that you're doing. And so the easy answer to that is just to burn more fossil fuels. Meanwhile, the energy transition itself requires more fossil fuels, as you mentioned, building all those solar panels and wind turbines and all the other stuff we're going to need, because solar panels and wind turbines produce electricity. Fine, electricity is a very, very versatile energy carrier, but we only use 20% of our energy in the form of electricity currently. The other 80% of the energy that we use, we get from liquid, gaseous, and solid fuels, fossil fuels. Right. So that 80% of energy usage needs to be electrified. But the technologies that we currently have are technologies that are based around burning these fuels. So that means shifting out most of our industrial infrastructure. The only way around that is to use electricity from solar and wind to make synthetic fuels by making hydrogen, as you were mentioning earlier, and then maybe combining the hydrogen from carbon taken from the atmosphere to make, methanol or something like that, a synthetic fuel. It certainly can be done. The chemistry is there. But would it be profitable? It would be very energy inefficient, and also would require the building of a whole new industry. We couldn't just repurpose all of our fossil fuel infrastructure, the refineries and so on, to make these synthetic fuels. No, it takes a whole new technological system, and it would be on the scale of the global fossil fuel industry. So imagine having to rebuild our whole fossil fuel energy industry over the next, 15, 20 years, which is what we're talking about in order to get to net zero. Plus building massive amounts of solar panels and wind turbines and so on. It's going to take a huge amount of energy. And again, most of that energy is going to be actually producing more carbon emissions. So as we approach the goal of reducing carbon emissions, we're actually having to produce more carbon emissions to achieve that end result. Now, if you play this out over the course of decades and decades, eventually you get there. If you make the investments in the low carbon technology and so on, by the end of the century, yes, emissions are way down and so on. But the process that we're going through now to try to get there is one that's actually making the problem worse over the short term.
You you mentioned the kind of impulse towards electrifying everything, which has become kind of the drill baby drill of our current milieu. I've read some resource analysts like Simon Michaud who say that there is nowhere near the actual mineral wealth necessary to facilitate a transition to renewable and a renewable electric system. And then other people say that there's a superabundance of these materials. Um, I guess because I want to believe in the inherent goodness of people, I approach that by saying that, well, okay, these different groups of people are all doing a systemic analysis. And the key to any system model is what are your start conditions and what's the size of your system. And so the differences in their answers, I don't think is because one group is being intentionally disingenuous, but because they have different ways of describing that system as they set it up. So, as someone who's studied these issues in depth, um, where do you think the truth is here?
Well, of course, the temptation is to say it's somewhere in between, but it's that's a facile answer because this is a very complex problem.
Mhm.
Simon Michaud has been raked over the coals in recent literature for his, and he's a mining guy. He's a works for the Finnish Geological Survey, Finland's Geological Survey. So he's mining is his forte, and so he should know a thing or two about mineral resources. Nevertheless, he has been rebutted very effectively in print by a number of analysts who say, well, no, in reality, there's lots of copper and lithium and neodymium and all of these minerals that we're going to need for the renewable energy revolution. We just need to open new mines and so on. Um, Now, I have written a few books on resource depletion, mostly relating to fossil fuels, but the spending years on this subject has taught me one thing, and that is you need to understand the resource quality pyramid if you're going to understand future availability of any non-renewable resources. The resource availability pyramid is like the easy stuff is at the top. And as you drill down through that pyramid to get the harder stuff, the extent of the resources increase, but the amount of effort required to get those resources increases exponentially.
Hmm.
So some surveys say, well, we have thousands of years worth of coal in the world. And theoretically, that's right. But if you start looking at where that coal is, a lot of it's under seabeds where it'd be very costly to extract. Some of it's in coal seams that are very thin, very difficult to extract. Some of it's chemically bonded with very toxic uh, chemicals and minerals that will make it very expensive to extract. Some of it's very deeply buried, and so on. So if you just look at the coal that's actually economical to extract, it's a much smaller quantity. The same basic principle is going to be true with all of these minerals. Yeah, there's potentially enough to build out the first generation or maybe even the second generation of wind turbines and solar panels and all the industrial equipment that we're going to need for a all renewable energy system. But as time goes on, it's going to get harder and harder, more expensive to get those minerals. Now, the answer, of course, that's being proposed is the circular economy, just recycling everything. Okay, we get some lithium out of the ground, and then we just continue recycling it forever and ever more. But there are practical limits to recycling. Many materials degrade as they're recycled. And one estimate that I read, a very interesting study by a French researcher looking at the limits to recycling. Okay, so we get the first generation of all these materials in sufficient quantity to build the systems and so on. How long could we continue to recycle them? How long would industrial civilization last on that basis if we continue at the current scale?
Mhm.
His answer was 200 years, which, that means you and I can go to bed tonight and sleep soundly because, we're not going to be around 200 years from now. But if we're thinking about a civilization's longevity, 200 years is an eye blink in time. But that's just one calculation.
Mhm.
Nobody knows the exact answer to these questions. What's important to understand is the basic trends, how it's, what the trade-offs are, the resource pyramid, and the increase in cost and difficulty and energy input required as minerals deplete.
You touched on something that I think that people miss when talking about renewable energy, is that all of the infrastructure is not renewable, right? If you build a solar panel, for example, that product has a life to it. And so even if you calculate, oh, okay, well, we have enough resources to build this infrastructure, um, assuming some kind of fossil fuel subsidy, that we're using, something to provide the electricity to do that that's not renewable energy itself, um, you have to do it again in 20 years, and then again in 20 years, and then again, and like you have to continually replace this. And, I've read some things that say, the infrastructure that we're using for electricity right now has really been around since like the 1950s. Like it's so it's now getting near the end of it, kind of the end of its lifespan. But the turnover on wind turbines and solar panels and things of this nature is much faster. And so we'll be talking about building the infrastructure and then building it again and then building it again, and without even talking about what's happening to all of these pieces of the infrastructure as they're decommissioned. Um, and the chemicals involved with solar panels, for example, first of all, it's a very dirty object to make. But then it's also a difficult object to decommission because there's nowhere that you can put it, that it's not going to, cause more harm to the environment that it was created supposedly to save. So there's the intended consequences and then the unintended consequences that come from that. Um, a lot of people may have concerns for, the environment in sort of a broad way. But when you kind of drill down into it, what they're mostly concerned about is kind of the security of their way of life. Uh, and so in 2020, the Congressional Budget Office projected that climate change would, on net, reduce the average annual real GDP growth by 1% from 2020 to 2050. And that number is relative to growth that would have occurred under the climatic conditions that prevailed up to the end of the 20th century. Do you think that the CBO is pricing in all of the impacts of the climate crisis adequately in making an assessment like that?
Um, no. um, this is economist speak, and economists take a very, very narrow view of how things really work. To them, it's all labor and capital, right? That's basically all there is in the economy. But in fact, of course, I have a little slide somewhere I include in my slide presentations, and it's something I grabbed from Investopedia, and it's a picture of the economy, producers and consumers, and of course it's mediated by dollar sign. And to economists, that is the economy. But of course, where does all the stuff come from that enables the economy to work? The energy and the materials. It comes from the earth, the sun. And those just don't factor into the economic equations. They're taken for granted. And so when the CBO does this kind of econometric analysis, it's taking all of the things that really matter for granted and then just working the numbers. What is climate change going to do to global food production? That's kind of important. I mean, food is what enables us human beings to survive. The climatologists, the scientists who are looking at this are extremely worried. They see famine, flood, and storms and droughts and so on, dramatically impacting human world food production. But that doesn't in the econometric analysis, that only shows up in terms of the GDP of agriculture, right? How much profit is being made in agriculture? That's reflected, but the actual food is just taken for granted. Of course, well, there'll be food. It just might be a little more expensive. Well, what if there isn't food? People die, you know. But that's just one example. But it's the analysis is fundamentally flawed. And what needs to be done is an ecological analysis that takes these things into account: soil, water, food, biodiversity, human health, et cetera, et cetera. And then you get a much more realistic estimate of the real costs of climate change. And of course, they're much, much, much higher.
So similarly, while people may sort of have a broad concern about the environment or animals or the ocean or whatever it is, a lot of times when you really drill down into it, they're like, yes, but how is this going to impact me as a human being? So if we set aside for a minute the kind of deep ecology argument that other forms of life that are not human, have a right to exist. What are the existential risks for humans associated with the disappearance of wild nature, both on the land and in the ocean?
Mm-hmm. Well, ecosystems are mutually supportive networks, with lots of nodes, and you can take out a node here and you can take out a node there, and the network still has a fair amount of resilience. But beyond a certain point, that resilience declines to the stage where you take out one more node and the whole thing collapses. And when ecosystems collapse, human beings do not do well. We've seen this in instances throughout human history. And of course, other species disappear as a result of ecosystem collapse too. But guess what? We are a species. We are living organisms that require food and oxygen and so on. Where does that oxygen come from? Well, a lot of it comes from oceans, forests. These are ecosystems. Ocean ecosystems are highly imperiled, not just as a result of overfishing, but also toxics, plastics, and other chemicals in the oceans. The oxygen dissolved in the ocean is declining. That's impacting all the animals that live in oceans. Temperature of oceans is increasing. The ocean currents are changing. People who study the oceans closely are concerned that, in fact, over the course of this century, we could, in effect, cause the death of oceans as ecosystems. That's pretty huge. that there's no way humanity does that and goes on unscathed. In fact, most living things on Earth would perish as a result of that. But that's where we're headed right now. And ocean ecosystems, that's most of the planet. Maybe that's 70%. But ecosystems on land, same thing. We rely on ecosystem services that we don't pay for because nature's doing it. Nature's doing it for us. And we just assume it, like the economists I was talking about earlier. We just assume that that's going to go on. But if we imperil the ecosystems, then those ecosystem services go away, whether it's the pollination of plants, including human food crops, or the production of oxygen in forests and oceans. It's absolutely key to not just the survival of, you know, a rare hummingbird somewhere or something like that, but us and our children and grandchildren.
I'm going to pivot just a little bit from that cheery cheery note. Um, let's see, in your book Power, you discuss at great length the intimate relationship between the complexity of a civilization and the available power to run it. Could you share just a little bit on that for those who have yet to read the book about why hydrocarbons have been so fundamental to industrial modernity?
Mhm. Well, the emergence of state societies, what we often call civilization, occurred, you know, 5, 6, 7,000 years ago as a result of energy surplus in the form of storable grains, agriculture. Once we had storable grains, then there was the possibility of building sedentary societies that stayed in one place and accumulated wealth, and then also created full-time division of labor. So you had some people who were full-time farmers, other people full-time soldiers, inventors, and, you know, tax collectors and all kinds of things. And you get that's civilization, right? So it depends upon an energy surplus. And from the beginning of civilization up until a couple of hundred years ago, that energy surplus came from grain agriculture and was applied via muscle power, either from human muscles, and of course, most of these societies were slave societies, or animal muscle, you know, horses, oxen, and so on. Then we get to the last couple of hundred years and we get fossil fuels, and suddenly everything goes crazy. All the graphs go off the charts in terms of economic growth, economic productivity, population. Human population goes from 1 billion in 1800 to 8 billion today, a rate of population growth never seen anywhere before in human history. On and on. I mean, if just about every graph describing any important trend going on in the world is a hockey stick graph, that where everything has just gone, has skyrocketed just in the last 200 years, and especially in the last 70 years. Because starting in 1950, petroleum really came on big time. We've been extracting petroleum since the 1850s, but oil really came on as a major energy source globally after the 1950s. And then we saw the most rapid rate of economic growth again all time. So it's all down to fossil fuels. That energy subsidy, which is what we've called it already in our conversation, that energy subsidy enabled complexity, social complexity, not only more disparity in incomes and different occupations and so on, but also development of new technologies to use this energy, automobiles, airplanes, computers, the whole works. You know, if you look at agriculture, what agriculture looked like in 1800, 90% of the population had to work at agriculture in order to provide enough surplus for 10% to be full-time accountants, et cetera, et cetera. Today, it takes 1 to 2% of the population to produce enough food because of fossil-fueled agriculture, the tractors, the combines, and so on. It takes 1 to 2%. So that the rest of that, you know, 90% of the population, almost 90% of the population has been freed to do other things. And we found jobs for them. The whole modern way of life where you have a job, the very idea of, you know, everybody being employed by a company or by somebody else hardly existed in 1800. Yes, of course, employment existed in cities, But again, only 10% of people lived that way. Most people were small landholders or slaves working on plantations. That's all shifted, and it's all because of fossil fuels. So as fossil fuels go away, which they inevitably will, whether it's as a result of fighting climate change or simply as a result of the depletion of oil, coal, and natural gas, as fossil fuels go away, society is going to change in profound ways. Are we up to the task of redesigning society in a way that is commensurate with the available energy and materials that will also minimize the conflict and suffering that human beings are going to otherwise face as we go through this period of change?
I, in talking with people specifically about agriculture, even though that number of actual human bodies is now down to, 2 or 3% of the population involved in some kind of agrarian activity, I said it's very interesting to me that in the United States in specific, that we keep two pools of labor who are um, profoundly marginalized in comparison to the rest of the population, incarcerated people and undocumented immigrants. And that when it's politically uh, not tenable to use your incarcerated people, then we get more undocumented workers. And when the proliferation of undocumented workers becomes politically untenable, here comes the incarcerated population of farm workers. And so, my question is, in 50 years, when there will inarguably be less net energy available by any reasonable metric, where do you think that labor is going to come from?
That's a good question because it has to be skilled labor. Anybody who actually grows food knows that it takes skill to do it. You can't just, go out and decide to become a farmer and make a profit and produce, good crops the first year. Uh, First of all, of course, it takes good soil and conditions, a stable climate, and so on. But you have to understand a lot. You have to be, in effect, a good scientist in order to be a good farmer. Right now, the average age of an American farmer is well over 50. I haven't kept track in the last few years. The last time I looked at the statistic, it was about 56, 58, the average age of an American farmer. Those people are aging out. Who's going to be growing our food for us? I did a back of the envelope calculation 15, 20 years ago that we would need about 50 million extra farmers in order to guarantee our food security just for this country uh, over the rest of in the next few decades. And who's training those farmers? Who's making it profitable for them to want to become a farmer? Because a lot of farmers don't want their kids to be farmers because they know how hard it is, and they figure there's maybe if I could give my kid a good education, he or she could become an IT developer or something like that, and have a much easier life. So yeah, that's a huge problem.
I met a farmer recently and asked him what his cash crop was, and he said debt.
Yeah,
And gave me that look like I get asked that question a lot. So,
yeah.
in your essay, you cite political polarization as one of the key obstacles to mounting a cohesive social response to the polycrisis. Um, in Joseph Tainer's book, The Collapse of Complex Societies, he underscores that progressive social incoherence is a byproduct of the decline in energy availability. Can political polarization and other degradations in our social fabric perhaps be better understood as a component of energy decline?
Yeah, that's one component, but it's political polarization is a very complex phenomenon. And it's not just a result of declining energy availability. Uh, it's better understood as a decline in um, personal expectations of the majority of the population. If people feel as though their lot in life is diminishing, they get pretty critical of the people who are running things. And there's another feed in to political polarization, which is economic inequality. Take economic inequality and add time, and you get political polarization. Because again, extreme economic inequality makes people frustrated, and they want somebody to blame. Peter Turchin, who's a complexity scientist, who's studied this problem very thoroughly over the last 20 years or so, has done so through data, big data. He and his colleagues have gathered statistical data on hundreds of societies over the last several thousand years and looked for patterns in the data. And the biggest pattern that leaps out is that societies tend to, increase in complexity and then decrease in complexity rapidly, which we call collapse, on a regular basis. And it follows very closely the cycle of increasing economic inequality. Now, the thing about civilization, we talked about civilization earlier, where it's due to an energy surplus, a storable energy surplus.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, well, that tends to result in more economic inequality. Now, it doesn't have to. There are strategies that some societies use to at least temporarily, manage or reduce economic inequality, even as surpluses continue to accrue. Taxation of wealth, redistribution, government welfare programs, and so on. All of those are strategies that have been used, but they're bucking the tide. In a capitalist system with an energy surplus, the tendency will be for economic inequality to increase and increase and increase, unless these kinds of strategies are applied ever more vigorously. And of course, the people at the top of the economic pyramid don't like those strategies, taxation and redistribution and so on, because they eat into their, they feel like, well, hey, I'm getting wealthy and I deserve this wealth because I'm smart. Somehow I got to the top of the pyramid and, I deserve to be here. So I don't want any, government leaders telling me that I have to be taxed at a higher rate or something. So the result is conflict among elites, what Turchin calls elite overproduction. As there's more wealth, more and more people want to get to the top of that economic pyramid. So they're doing whatever is necessary to invest in getting there, whether it's investing in new technology or investing in education. In the US, the number of people with law degrees, so being a lawyer is a ticket to elite status, right? So the number of people with law degrees has absolutely exploded in the last 50 years. But once you have lots of people who want that elite status, then there's more and more conflict over a finite supply of elite positions within government, industry, and so on. So the result is more conflict among elites. And that's again, this feeds into political polarization. It's not something that shows up in the headlines, who's writing about other than Peter Turchin? Who's writing about the number of law degrees as a cause of our political problems in the U.S.? It's not obvious. You have to study systems in a systemic way in order to uncover these kinds of hidden drivers. But when we look at the US political situation today, which is highly polarized, very dangerous, extremely precarious, you know, it's as big a problem in its own way as any of the other things we've been talking about, because unless we have political solidarity and social solidarity, where we all feel like we're in this together and we're willing to make some sacrifices, mutual sacrifices, in order to get the best possible outcome, unless we have that, then we can't really deal with any of these problems.
Viewers, I just want to let you know that we had a review of Peter Turchin's new book, End Times, in the January issue of WLT. So if you're interested, go to the website and check that out. Let's see here. In the conclusion to your essay, you say that the path forward will require a significant sacrifice of wealth, dominance, or comfort met with a sober assessment of the full array of our actual problems. Do you see signs that governments, as we have formulated them since the beginning of the Industrial Revolution, can play a productive role in that process?
Um, in theory, yes. Um, I think everyone who engages in politics or political theory seriously, who has an understanding of systemic understanding of economics and politics and these sorts of things, understands that one of the purposes of government is to limit and redistribute power. Power is a good thing in that without power, we can't do anything. We talk about the power of flight, the power of speech, and so on. Power is using language, or excuse me, it's using energy to do things, right? And so it's good. We need power, but it's always possible to have too much of a good thing. We need rainfall, but if you get too much rainfall, you got a flood, right? Well, same thing with power. If you have too much power in societies and it gets too concentrated, then things go very bad. And even on a big scale, can humanity have too much power over the natural world? Well, I would argue yes. And climate change, species extinctions, global toxification, these are symptoms of one species, ours, having temporarily too much power, more power than it can use for its own good. So government theoretically has the role of reining in overuse of power, whether it's too much economic inequality, whether it's regulating toxic chemicals, whether it's regulating greenhouse gas emissions. A competent government in our situation would be doing all of these things on a much greater scale than is currently happening. But we've gone so far because fossil fuels have given us so much power so fast. We've been able to increase the scale of human energy usage, the scale of our societies, the size of our population, the size of our economy, so far and so fast that if we were going to avert the polycrisis, we would actually have to change direction and reduce our reliance on chemicals, reduce our greenhouse gas emissions by reducing our energy usage. And we have a profit-driven society with a debt overhang. And so if we try to make that course correction, it will actually create as many problems, or over the short term, it will create problems that will seem as serious as climate change and all the rest. And so nobody wants to do that. Realistically, I don't think governments have the power to, because we've just gone too far. There's going to be a correction, but it's not going to be driven by policy. It's going to be driven by events essentially out of policymakers' control. Now, does that mean policymakers have no usefulness anymore? They can't influence things at all? Of course they can. The direction of change is going to shift, and that won't be as a result of policy. It will be as a result of breakdown in systems, natural systems and human systems. But how that breakdown is managed still matters a lot. If societies decomplexify, which would be the Joseph Tainter way of looking at it, if they simplify over the course of the next few decades in a chaotic and completely uncontrolled way, things could get very, very bad. I mean, global war over what's left, collapsing ecosystems, et cetera, massive human mortality and suffering. It doesn't have to be that way. It's still possible to manage this change of direction in a way that minimizes human suffering and the destruction of the natural world. But it will require policymakers to exercise a lot of courage and judgment that so far they've been unwilling to bring to the table. I know this is it's a challenging conclusion to come to, and folks who just want to have hope for the future, hope that we can continue living the way we are now, or that things will even be better. They hear a talk like this and they go running for the exits. But there have to be some adults in the room who see that this is where we've come to, this is where we're going, and if we're going to avert the worst, it's going to take some courage and compassion and some realism, some willingness to face some unpleasant truths.
Thank you so much.